Going to the pub, grabbing a bottle of whiskey, and just sitting down was one of the nicer feelings, back in the 1900s. And I'm sure you remember that time fondly. But maybe these days you can't really find the whiskey you used to have. To jog your memory, here's a list of 10 vanished whiskies that every true Brit remembers, but which you can no longer find today. Once a staple on the shelves of pubs, corner shops, and Christmas cabinets, these bottles defined generations of taste. Some were victims of the great whiskey crash of the 1980s. Others disappeared quietly when distilleries were shut down or taken over. And if you learned something new or remembered something from the past, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. Now let's start off the list. Strathmore is one of those whiskies that has all but slipped from memory, yet for those who tasted it, the name brings back a wave of nostalgia. A Lowland single malt, Strathmore carried the hallmarks of its region, since it was light, grassy, and delicately sweet. It wasn't the sort of whiskey that tried to overpower you with smoke or weight. Instead, it was subtle, refined, and perfectly suited to evenings where conversation mattered more than intensity. That made it a favourite among many who preferred a gentler dram, one that you could enjoy steadily without ever feeling overwhelmed. But Strathmore was a casualty of the 1980s whiskey crisis, when a global oversupply forced companies to cut back production and shut down smaller, less promoted distilleries. Strathmore simply couldn't compete against the marketing muscle of the bigger names, and by the mid-80s, the stills were silenced for good. Today, the distillery's name is scarcely mentioned outside of enthusiast circles, and surviving bottles are few and far between. For older drinkers, though, Strathmore represents something more personal. A reminder of a whiskey landscape that was once far more diverse when small characterful distilleries dotted Scotland and offered tastes that have now vanished forever. To remember Strathmore is to remember a gentler side of Scotch that we've sadly lost. Once upon a time, Ainslie's was one of those names you'd see almost everywhere, like on pub shelves, in corner shop windows, and in households across Britain. With blends like Royal Edinburgh and King's Legend, Ainslie's had carved out a reputation for warmth, depth, and a touch of smoky charm that gave it a distinctive profile. It was the kind of Scotch that could be enjoyed equally well in a celebratory toast or in the quiet of a fireside evening. Unlike some of the flashier international brands, Ainslie's never traded on prestige alone. It was trusted because it was consistent, approachable, and dependable. Unfortunately, the whiskey world of the late 20th century was ruthless. As the market consolidated and global giants tightened their grip, Ainslie's lost ground. Advertising budgets, not taste, began to dictate survival, and by the late 1980s, Ainslie's had faded away, another casualty of corporate priorities. Today, the name survives only in dusty bottles at auction, but for many older drinkers, the memory lingers of a brand that stood by them through countless gatherings, family milestones, and casual nights at the local. Ainslie's wasn't just a whiskey, it was part of the everyday fabric of British life, and its disappearance left a quiet but undeniable gap. Chequers was the sort of whiskey that made its mark not by being bold, but by being steady. Produced by John McEwan Co Ltd, its 12-year-old expression was particularly beloved in the 1960s and 70s. Smooth, rounded, with just enough malt character shining through the blend, it offered a balance that was perfect for those who wanted a reliable bottle without the fuss. It was a whiskey that seemed to appear everywhere, like at weddings, on sideboards in modest homes, and in pubs where it quietly held its place among more famous names. What people loved about Chequers was its honesty. It was affordable, it tasted good, and it carried a sense of tradition without pretension. But as with so many blends of its era, Chequers fell victim to shifting market dynamics. By the 1980s, the whiskey industry was undergoing radical change, with a shrinking domestic market and the rise of heavily marketed global blends. Chequers simply couldn't compete in that arena, and before long, it disappeared from the shelves. For many, its absence wasn't immediately noticed. It was the kind of whiskey you took for granted, always there when you needed it. But in the years since, those who remember Chequers look back fondly on it as a symbol of a more straightforward time, when whiskey didn't need glossy branding or hype to find its way into people's glasses. It was dependable, it was familiar, and it was loved. Before the name Brora took on legendary status, there was the old Clynelish, bottled in the 1960s and 70s under the stewardship of Ainslie and Heilbron. This 12-year-old expression was something truly special, a Highland malt that combined a waxy, oily texture with rich, earthy flavours and a subtle smokiness that set it apart from its peers. To those who tried it, the whiskey had a unique weight and character, the kind of dram that seemed to speak directly of the rugged northern landscape it came from. It wasn't polished in the modern sense, it was raw, powerful, and deeply memorable. When the new Clynelish distillery was built next door in 1967, the original site was renamed Brora, and the old 12-year Ainslie bottlings gradually faded out. By the 1980s, both Brora and its predecessor had fallen victim to the great closures, and the original Clynelish 12 was gone forever. For older drinkers, the memory of that whiskey carries a kind of reverence. Today, collectors pay eye-watering sums for surviving bottles, but for those who had the chance to taste it back then, no amount of money could replace the simple memory of pouring a glass of old Clynelish and savouring a dram that was truly one of a kind. C&J Macdonald's was once a respected Scotch whisky firm, producing blends such as Queen's Choice and Fine Old, brands that enjoyed a loyal following in Britain before the industry consolidated under bigger players. Unlike single malts tied to specific distilleries, Macdonald's operated as an independent blender and bottler, sourcing whiskies from across Scotland to craft balanced and accessible products. Queen's Choice was particularly marketed during the mid-20th century as a whisky of refinement, sometimes associated with royal branding that appealed to post-war consumers seeking a touch of luxury. Fine Old, meanwhile, was positioned as a dependable everyday blend, offering smoothness and a mellow sweetness that aligned with the tastes of the time. Both brands were affordable, but carried a reputation for quality, especially in export markets, where they contributed to Scotch whisky's international growth. As the whisky industry contracted and consolidated in the 1970s and 1980s, independent blenders like C&J Macdonald's were increasingly absorbed or phased out. Larger companies dominated distribution and marketing, leaving smaller names without the same shelf presence. By the 1980s, Queen's Choice and Fine Old had faded from the market. Their production discontinued as consumer tastes shifted towards global brands like Johnnie Walker and Chivas Regal. Today, surviving bottles of C&J Macdonald's whiskies surface only at auctions or in collectors' cabinets. They represent an era when regional blenders played a vital role in shaping the Scotch market. Though long gone, these brands are a reminder of the breadth of choice once available to British drinkers before consolidation narrowed the field. St Magdalene, also known by its hometown name Linlithgow, was one of the most historic distilleries in Scotland. Distilling on the site can be traced back to at least the late 18th century, with some sources suggesting activity even earlier. Located in the town of Linlithgow, just west of Edinburgh, St Magdalene was a classic Lowland distillery, producing a distinctive grassy, herbal and lightly citrus single malt that stood apart from the heavier Highland styles. For much of its life, St Magdalene's whisky was primarily destined for blends. Its clean, dry profile made it a blender's favourite, offering balance and freshness. Under the ownership of the Distillers Company Limited, the distillery operated steadily through much of the 20th century, though it never became a household name among single malts. Nonetheless, occasional bottlings under the rare malt selection and from independent bottlers revealed the distillery's character. It was light but complex, with notes of green apple, hay, and a subtle mineral edge. St Magdalene was closed in 1983 during the Great Downturn that saw many smaller distilleries shuttered. Unlike some others, its buildings were not demolished but instead repurposed into residential flats. The iconic pagoda roof still stands, a visible reminder to passing trains of the town's whisky-making past. Today, surviving bottles of St Magdalene are highly collectible, especially well-aged expressions that showcase the distillery's refined Lowland profile. For whisky lovers, it remains one of the most poignant symbols of the lost Lowland tradition, a style that has become increasingly rare. Carsebridge Distillery, founded in 1799 in Alloa, Clackmannanshire, began life as a malt whisky distillery before evolving into one of Scotland's great grain whisky powerhouses. Its early years reflected the dynamic nature of the whisky industry during the 19th century, when new technologies and the rise of blending transformed Scotch into a global phenomenon. By the mid-1800s, Carsebridge shifted from malt production to continuous stills, allowing it to produce grain whisky on an industrial scale. Throughout the late 19th and 20th centuries, Carsebridge became a key supplier to blenders such as Johnnie Walker, Dewar's, and Buchanan's. Its whisky was valued for its mellow, slightly sweet character that provided body and smoothness to blends. By the 20th century, the distillery was operating as part of the Distillers Company Limited, later Diageo, and had grown into one of the largest grain distilleries in Scotland, boasting vast coffee stills and warehouse complexes. Despite its size and reputation, Carsebridge could not escape the rationalisation of the 1980s, when oversupply and declining demand forced widespread closures. Production ended in 1983, and the site was later demolished, erasing nearly 2 centuries of history. Today, Carsebridge bottlings are incredibly scarce, appearing only through independent bottlers or Diageo's limited special releases. These old grain whiskies, often aged 40 years or more, are prized for their silky textures, notes of vanilla, toffee, and tropical fruits, and they're to showcase the elegance of mature grain spirit. While the distillery is gone, Carsebridge lives on in rare bottles treasured by enthusiasts. Dallas Dhu was established in 1899 near Forres in Moray, at the heart of Speyside, during a late Victorian boom in distilling. Its founder, Alexander Edward, was an ambitious entrepreneur who also built other distilleries, such as Benromach. Dallas Dhu's whisky was intended mainly for blending, prized for its light, fragrant Highland character that added elegance and balance. However, the distillery's fortunes were unstable from the beginning, and over the decades, it changed ownership multiple times, eventually falling under the umbrella of the Distillers Company Limited. By the 20th century, Dallas Dhu was a small-scale operation in comparison to its larger neighbours. It never achieved fame in its own right, but those who tasted its single malts described them as delicate, floral, and slightly honeyed, with grassy notes typical of its Speyside setting. Production continued until the early 1980s, when the whisky industry experienced a painful contraction. Oversupply, changing drinking habits, and economic pressures forced many distilleries to close, and Dallas Dhu produced its final spirit in 1983. Rather than being dismantled or redeveloped, Dallas Dhu found a unique afterlife. Historic Scotland preserved the distillery as a museum, freezing it in time as it looked on its last day of operation. Visitors can still walk through the malt barns, still house, and warehouses, gaining a rare glimpse of how traditional Scotch whisky was made. Though Dallas Dhu bottlings are now extremely rare and command high prices at auction, the distillery itself remains alive as a monument to Scotch whisky heritage. Glen Albyn was a Highland distillery founded in 1846 in Inverness, a city that once boasted 3 working distilleries, but now has none. Its story is one of resilience, revival, and ultimately, disappearance. Glen Albyn's early years were turbulent, with frequent changes of ownership and periods of closure. By the late 19th century, under the stewardship of Alexander Matheson and later the McKinley family, it found greater stability and began to produce whisky that became highly valued for blending. The distillery was never a major single malt brand during its lifetime, yet those who have tasted independent bottlings describe a bold Highland character. It was rich and malty, with earthy tones, dried fruit, and a faint whiff of smoke. Its whisky had a weightiness that made it an excellent backbone in blends, particularly when paired with lighter Lowland or grain whiskies. Like many smaller distilleries, Glen Albyn fell victim to the whisky downturn of the early 1980s. With oversupply flooding the market, the Distillers Company Limited, which owned Glen Albyn by then, shut it down in 1983. Unlike some distilleries that survived as museums or warehouses, Glen Albyn's fate was more final. The site was demolished and a supermarket was built in its place. Today, Glen Albyn exists only in rare bottles, often from independent bottlers like Gordon and MacPhail. These whiskies have become collectors' treasures, offering a glimpse into Inverness's lost whisky-making tradition and reminding us of the once vibrant distilling scene in the Highland capital. The Caledonian distillery, affectionately known as the Cally, was one of Edinburgh's great whisky landmarks. Founded in 1855, it was a vast grain distillery situated in the heart of the city, its towering chimney a familiar sight to locals for more than a century. Unlike single malt producers tied to a single style, the Caledonian specialised in grain whisky, which formed the backbone of many of Scotland's best-known blends. The whisky it produced was smooth, slightly sweet, and versatile, making it perfect for marrying with robust Highland and peaty Ainslie malts. Grain whisky from the Cally lent body and elegance to blends, and the distillery became an industrial giant, once boasting some of the largest coffee stills in the world. Its sheer scale made it a powerhouse of Scotch production during the 19th and 20th centuries. However, by the 1980s, changes in the industry and efficiency drives led to the distillery's closure in 1988. Unlike some lost distilleries, the Cally's story didn't end quietly. In 2015, Diageo released a special bottling, Caledonian, the Cally 40-year-old, as part of its special releases series. This rare expression showcased the depth grain whisky could achieve: rich layers of vanilla, toffee, dark fruit, and polished oak, a reminder of the distillery's former glory. Today, the original distillery buildings have been redeveloped, but the legend of the Cally endures. Collectors and connoisseurs still speak fondly of it, remembering Edinburgh's proud place in Scotland's whisky heritage. And that's it for today's trip down memory lane. Give the video a like if you ever had any of these whiskies, and don't forget to subscribe for more information and nostalgia. See you next time.